Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for EFA Talks. This afternoon, we have a wonderful guest in Vanessa Teague, and I'm confident, based on the conversation I was just having with her, that this will be a particularly interesting discussion and topical, given the numerous elections that are coming up. Before I introduce Vanessa, I'd like to pay tribute and recognition to the First Nations people and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Australia is a wonderful country with a rich history, and there's a lot in the way that our communities have organised themselves in the past that we can learn from today. And without that vibrant history, I don't think we'd be the country where we could have conversations like we're about to have. I'd also like to thank the EFA team for their ongoing support in running these events, and particularly to Robin Doherty and the team at ThoughtWorks for powering and making us available to you across the country and across the world via this platform. So this afternoon, we have Vanessa Teague, who is the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity and an adjunct associate professor in the Research School of Computer Sciences at ANU. Her research primarily focuses on cryptographic methods for achieving security and privacy, particularly for issues of public interest, such as election integrity and the protection of government data. She was a part of the team with Chris Culnane and Ben Rubinstein, who discovered the easy re-identification of doctors and patients in the Medicare PBS open dataset released by the Australian Department of Health. She has co-designed numerous protocols for improved election integrity in e-voting systems and co-discovered serious weaknesses in the cryptography deployed in e-voting systems in New South Wales, Western Australia, and Switzerland. It seems to me that elections, the way that we're governed and the way that our parliaments assemble here in Australia and also internationally, is currently a fairly pressing and interesting issue, and I'm absolutely confident in years to come this will become a bigger and bigger issue. It's particularly important to understand this from a digital rights perspective, in my view, because the way we elect and the way we are governed is fundamental to our democratic society and fundamental to the way that our rights are both protected and preserved. So I think an easy way to start off, Vanessa, is some people might say that online banking is perfectly secure. So if online banking is secure, why can't we just vote on the internet?
Excellent. Thank you, Angus. That's exactly the right Dorothy Dixon to start with. Okay, for two reasons. First of all, online banking isn't perfectly secure. And secondly, online voting is a great deal harder. So the really, really hard problem that we haven't solved in online voting is giving you the opportunity to check that your vote has been properly recorded on your device and properly sent into the Electoral Commission without making it possible for you to prove how you voted. So it's these two conflicting requirements, verifiability and vote privacy, that we just don't know how to do remotely. And so one of the interesting things is, although we found several different bugs in the Swiss internet voting system, the bug that really upset the Swiss authorities and the Swiss citizenry was a bug in precisely the part of the Swiss internet voting system that allowed the voter, that was meant to allow the ordinary voter to check that the vote their computer was sending off up to the central electoral system really matched their intentions. And the bug there meant that it was possible for malware on their computer to change their vote into some nonsense that wouldn't actually be counted, and yet still give them back the correct checking codes that they'd so carefully designed to give them evidence that their vote hadn't been manipulated, when in fact it could have been.
Which is a particularly difficult situation, because there's a lot of convenience that I can see attached to online banking, for example, rather than having to go draw checks and attend a physical bank. But it seems the architecture might be a bit of a problem attached to this. And I hear those points completely. It is a difficult balancing act, and it is something that would be quite difficult to address. While we move through this as well, Vanessa, I thought I might let our audience know that there are two ways that we can communicate, and that is the Q&A function in Zoom as well as chat. So if people have questions as we move through this, feel free to jump in on the conversation. And I thought, if we're in the context of security and these systemic issues like the example you just gave of the Swiss voting process, I think an interesting difficulty exists in terms of the integrity of these systems and the architecture of these systems. In 2018, I presented a paper in Stockholm entitled The Global Union, which was a response to a call for papers and proposed a means to re-architecting international governance structures. In part, that proposal included a recommendation or a concept of an augmented technological aggregation of individual opinions collected at a local, domestic and international level, and was intended effectively to aggregate people's opinions across the world in small communities at a national level and then an international level as a form of consensus building for international governance. One of the biggest hurdles, and there were many hurdles, that I faced in making that proposal was the integrity of the digital architecture and the infrastructure that is available to people to allow that process to occur. Given the recent examples of digital systems deployed by our federal government and some of the sagas that are sat around, for example, the issue with robo-debt, which we've discussed previously on EFA Talks, the issue of the census and some of the serious issues that happened with respect to servers crashing when the census was moved online, and recently with the COVID Safe app, which not only have there been, in my view, legal, but also technical issues associated with the deployment of the COVID Safe app. Is this something, being e-voting, that could actually be deployed in Australia? Do we have the architecture to allow this?
No. So we have a large system in New South Wales called the iVote system, which has exactly the same, in fact, serious security problems as the Swiss system and a fair bit less profound inclination to try and fix them. So I think it's really interesting. You've asked this kind of fundamental question about what works and what doesn't work. But all of the examples that you've pointed to, with the notable exception of COVID Safe app, are things that have very obviously failed, right? We can tell when we go and try and log into the census and the server is down, we can tell that it failed, right? We know when people are getting robo-debt notices that they clearly don't deserve, that something about that algorithm has failed. But of course, with security properties, they're notoriously difficult to try to detect, right? Because if your vote is being manipulated in transit or on your device, then there's no way that you would necessarily know. And similarly for privacy problems, if other people find out about how you voted, then you aren't necessarily going to know in advance that your vote privacy isn't being properly protected. So there's this critically important question of, well, how would we know if it wasn't secure? And in fact, what we have in Australia is for some reason, a tradition of keeping the code for these kinds of critically important public processes secret, which is quite the opposite of the tradition you see in more advanced countries like Switzerland, where there's legislative requirements for keeping the code public. And then the expectation is, well, you can't tell for sure whether it's secure or not, but at least if there are bugs, you've got some kind of chance of finding them. So your examples of things that have crashed, obviously, are probably the tip of the iceberg, right? In fact, the New South Wales iVote system's registration page crashed the Friday before election day, and a lot of people noticed and complained, right? But to me, in some ways, that's the least of your worries. Having the registration page crash, and at least people know, and at least even those people who are intending to vote for the internet over the internet can show up on a Saturday at a polling place, which is probably better anyway. That's not such a bad failure. The bad failure is that they had these fundamental cryptographic weaknesses in their back-end system that they weren't honest about, didn't admit to, and possibly didn't even really know about, but ran them right through the real election, which could have resulted in significant alterations to the ballot, and there's no way of anybody ever noticing.
Which is an interesting thing in terms of the point you've just made, and it's a really good way of distinguishing between two issues. The obvious fails, which often get the media, are not necessarily the most malicious or serious consequenced fails. It's the back end where you don't see this is the true ramification of what's happened when something has failed, and particularly if that's covered up. And I think the concept of transparency in voting is really important. So from the perspective of seeing who or for what someone has voted shouldn't be transparent. That's a matter between the citizen and their electoral process and the process of election. But understanding the chain of custody in the way that that vote is then taken and the verification that that vote remains with integrity from the point that it's collected to the point that it's recorded, I think is a critical point in this. And as I understand, chain of custody in electoral voting or e-voting is one of the biggest issues, because the integrity of that chain of custody is critical to the integrity of the system.
Absolutely.
One of the interesting things I think comes from this, and there's been quite a bit of media around voting and electoral tampering over the last couple of years, and probably most notably was the so-called Cambridge Analytica saga, which is effectively a marketing campaign intended to target and manipulate voters and sway democratic process. There's a lot that's been written on that. I think that's a very interesting example of how we interact in a digital environment and the consequences of moving towards a digital world. Do you think that e-voting has a positive or negative change to the landscape for lobbyists or political advertising and the likes of Cambridge Analytica and similar organisations?
Negative, I think, for two reasons. First of all, there's no way of enforcing any equivalent to our rules about having to leave people in peace for 50 metres around a polling place or whatever it is. You know, we have these rules in the physical polling place that there's no political advertising or political harassment within the 10 minutes or so that a person is just about to settle down and vote. Obviously, we can't enforce that for postal voting, which is bad enough. But there's no way to enforce it for computerised voting either, remote computerised voting, that is. There's another even more unhelpful consequence, which is the risk that all of those other programs, including quite invasive surveillance programs in some cases that run on people's devices, could potentially not just show them an ad, but could potentially directly listen to how they're voting or affect their vote. And I actually think in a country that has become so complacent about the secret ballot, because we adopted it first and we've had it forever and we take it for granted, the idea that we would vote remotely over a system that no longer protects the secrecy of how people vote is something that we should be very, very concerned about. And in particular, all of those national or international manipulation campaigns, and you know, you can pick your favorite bogey for any of these, right? It could be the Russians, it could be the Chinese Communist Party, it could be your political opponents, whether whoever they are. The possibility that they could directly use spyware or malware on the devices that are also being used to vote that could directly either alter or learn how people voted is a very, very serious concern.
And I suspect that there's a few things that come out of that. So the learning how people vote, I think, is a very important thing to the democratic process. So that I can make a secret vote and that the ballot isn't disclosed to anyone else allows me to fully exercise my political opinion as a right in Australia, as a constitutional right, without fear of reprimand or consequence.
Exactly.
If I was showing everyone in the community this is how I'm voting, I may not vote in the same way that I truly intend or wish to vote. Yep. But also, there's an interesting potential counter to the issue of the 50 metres away and leaving people in peace at the ballot. If e-voting allowed people to be informed about what they were voting for, so rather than it being a simple ballot and there was some information about the policies or core policies of the person or parties to which the vote is being ascribed, is that something that would be useful for democracy? Is that something that's viable in an e-voting system, or is that something that would be detrimental?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think there's a difference between getting that kind of information online and getting that kind of information immediately at the point you're voting, right? So you could get that information online if you're willing to put kind of 10 minutes into it in advance. And I guess you could be standing there in the queue outside the polling place getting that information. But I still see that as very, very different to then actually casting your vote on that device. For example, I always really loved the belowtheline.org site. There's a bunch of other similar kind of sites that roughly let you put together your own below the line vote, and they kind of give you links to click on the specific candidates that are standing in your state. And so you can calmly, in your own home, have a little think about who these people are and whether you'd like to vote for them or not, and then you can print it out and take it into the polling place with you. And I really like that idea because that seems to combine the best properties of the kind of information seeking that you're talking about with the secret ballot that is so important, because of course you can take a printout into the box, but you don't have to follow the printout once you get there.
Which is an interesting thing in terms of how informed people are when they vote. And I've often wondered how many people vote with a truly informed understanding of what they're voting for. So there's an issue that I would identify in Australian politics or Australian elections that is a personality vote rather than a policy vote. So rather than understanding exactly the policies that a person is aspiring to, and then having sufficient trust in that person that they would then responsibly and representatively continue to advocate those policies before Parliament or a legislative assembly, I think is up for grabs as a question in terms of how our democracy is going. There's a juxtaposition in terms of those who don't wish to vote, those who don't understand voting, in a compulsory voting setting like we have in Australia, and then a non-compulsory voting setting like America. Is e-voting something that would increase people's likelihood of voting, or is this something that would end up in the same situation where people who don't want to vote, people who don't care to vote, or people who don't wish to be informed would still shy away from this? Is it something that would be convenient, or is it something that takes away from what voting should actually be?
So this is a really good question, and a very contested question, because there are certainly plenty of people out there who will tell you that internet voting increases turnout. However, everybody who's carefully studied it has not found any significant effect. Now, it's really hard to answer this question rigorously in a reliable and scientific manner because, of course, in most countries where voting is voluntary, the turnout varies greatly from one election to the next. It depends on all kinds of things, like whether the candidates are both appealing or both horrid. It depends on whether it was a rainy day and all kinds of crazy stuff that would lose the increased turnout in the noise of everything else that's going on. So I know of only one really rigorous study that tried to compare whether or not internet voting increased turnout. It was a study in Switzerland in which there were some cantons that allowed internet voting and other cantons that did not allow internet voting. And the researchers who were Swiss were quite careful to compare, to try to control as much as they could for the differences between the different cantons. And basically they came to the conclusion that internet voting didn't make any difference to turnout. And there were a reasonably large number of different cantons that had made different choices. So it might make it more convenient for some people, but it doesn't overall seem to increase the total turnout for the election. Now, the reason that you sometimes get, particularly in New South Wales, a claim that it increases turnout among certain classes of voters is because it's in principle restricted to certain classes of voters, such as those who are overseas or those who are a very long way away from the polling place. But in practice, it's not restricted. So we get something like 200,000 people using the New South Wales iVote system, and they've all clicked the box to say, oh yeah, I'm out of state on election day. Oh, I'm hundreds of miles from the nearest polling place. Yeah, just let me vote over the internet. But it's very unclear what fraction of that people are actually sitting on a couch in Sydney and would be perfectly capable of showing up at a primary school on Saturday morning, but have simply chosen not to. So we get a much larger number of people ostensibly in the group who are too far away to vote in person, but we don't actually know whether all those people who clicked that button really are genuinely in that set or not.
Which is an interesting thought that I've had with this in terms of what the consequence of e-voting might be, or doing this in a way that's remote and digital. I could see a situation where we have more plebiscites, for example, because it's easier to conduct them, and maybe you end up with voting fatigue, or an issue where too much reliance is placed on voting, or that people cease to have a care factor about it because it doesn't have the same ritual or attachment as going to a physical polling booth and being required to do that. We've had a really interesting question from our audience, Vanessa, which is along those lines, and that is online voting perhaps more appropriate for lower stakes elections, with an example of student elections at universities? Is there a threshold where it's acceptable to have e-voting? Is there a line that's drawn in terms of the stakes, and what are those stakes?
Hi, Eleanor. Okay, I think my answer to that is it's like any other kind of security property, right? We care about manipulation and we care about privacy breach. And any kind of system is going to set up a bar. It's going to set a bar, right? You design it to be sufficiently hard to crack into from the outside. You put a set of people who are responsible for administering it, who are sufficiently carefully vetted or sufficiently unlikely to take bribes and sufficiently competent to not accidentally pick up a USB stick in the car park. However you design it, there's a certain price of successfully compromising and undermining it, right? And if the cost of your election is something like the Australian federal election or a New South Wales state election, the you really have to make sure that the cost of successfully manipulating it is higher than the benefit that could be gained for successfully manipulating it. And if we're talking about a state budget or control of national policy, I think it's very hard to believe that a system can be secured against that kind of attack. If we're talking about a student election, to speak to Eleanor's question, I still think it's probably really important to design a system in which the people administering the election are not able undetectably to alter the results, because I think, you know, even in small groups like student elections or trade union elections or whatever, there are insider attacks, right, that are important. But there are some very nice techniques for verifiable elections. For example, the Helios internet voting system, which we use in the International Association of Cryptographic Researchers, and which has been used in various university elections, which allows you to gain a proof that the election has been properly, that the votes have been properly added up, although the process of checking that your vote is correctly encoded is quite challenging and difficult, and you really have to rely on some fraction of students bothering to do it.
Which I think is a really interesting point in terms of that. What are the consequences of a vote and where that sits on a risk spectrum in terms of whether it's a national budget or whether it's a board resolution in a company to procure a software or to distribute a dividend, for example. There's another question that's come through in terms of comment that I made about a system may have too much reliance on voting. And the point that I was making there is that's a question more that sits in how we do democracy. And in my view, and my view alone, if you were to poll people every day in terms of whether they consider that the government is doing the right thing, you end up with a very turbulent system, and democracy is not necessarily achieved in the same way as a stable government would over a 4-year term. There's also an issue that I see with that there are groups or classes of people, like we see in America, that are willing to vote, those who are unwilling to vote, and those who just don't care at all. I think a consequence of voting too often in an electronic setting could be a fatigue of voting, or could be a situation where it destabilizes the overall governance of something. And again, that's a question that might sit in the scale concept of if it's a smaller issue or a smaller group, that may make more sense than attempting to poll or vote constantly in the Australian community. My view alone. But I thought I might take that concept into a slightly different but connected direction in terms of where functional e-voting systems exist. Are there any globally that exist? I know that there are some at a student election level, but are there governments that are using e-voting successfully? And have there been any issues in the process of creating a successful e-voting platform?
So I think it's worth mentioning that a large part of the motivation for the Swiss e-voting system is exactly what the person in the chat just asked, right? That they have their regular referenda. They vote quite frequently on quite a variety of specific things, and their argument is therefore that the convenience factor is extremely important, more important than it would be if they were only showing up every 3 years or something. That said, they have had, even despite their very good transparency rules, their very strong requirements for openness and verifiability and privacy, they have had very serious technical problems in their system. So I think the answer to your question is, is there any country currently running a sufficiently secure internet voting system? The answer is no. The Swiss probably have the best process, but that process has revealed some serious problems in the thing they had. So they are now engaged in a process of re-evaluating and considering that system. And I don't know how that will end. It may end with a new system, or it may end with deciding not to do it anymore. It's really up to them, and I don't think anybody knows for sure at the moment. Oh, somebody's asked, what do I think about Estonia's internet voting system? So Estonia's internet voting system is interesting because it works in a completely different way from the Swiss one. And basically, it works in a way that gives a reasonable guarantee of integrity, but much less focus on vote privacy. So you have some, you make a ciphertext on your own device, And then you can kind of interrogate your device and say, you know, give me a proof that you made my vote in the way that I asked. And it will cough up that proof for you, and you can take that proof to a different device and double check. So it gives reasonable integrity guarantees, although I haven't looked at the back end specifically. But the concern there is with the opportunity to use that proof then to prove to somebody else how you voted. And there's a long discussion to be had there, right? Because maybe you can make a few different votes but only submit one of them. So maybe you actually don't necessarily prove that you submitted the thing that you got the proof of the contents of. But even so, I think they are improving the system, but I don't think I would want that system running in my country.
There's another comment in the chat which I think underpins the whole concept of governance generally at a more broad level than elections, but particularly in relation to elections, and that's trust. So whether you're trusting in the ballot paper reaching as a chain of custody the count, or whether you're trusting in a digital vote reaching the count, or whether you're trusting that the election hasn't been swayed by some form of manipulation, or whether that's in a political advertising or lobbying way or in some form of corrupt way. The trust is inherent to the system, and without trust, I don't think there could be a system. It is an interesting discussion because this is a transition that could potentially happen between the physical way of voting and a digital way of voting, and there are inherently trust issues that exist in a physical voting sense that are, as Vanessa has said, amplified in the digital setting. There's a question I wanted to ask on that, Vanessa, and very quickly appreciating the time, as I'd like to keep these as brief and succinct as possible. But there is a whole heap of nice and wonderful people that administer the Senate count, and there's no reason why I can say directly that any one of them or the group of them are untrustworthy. Is this something that we should be trusting acceptably without any further verification, or is an audit of the count necessary in both the physical and the digital form?
Yes. How do we get to 2 o'clock without mentioning the Senate count? Okay, so first of all, most people don't even realise that the Senate counting solution was produced by the same people who made the New South Wales iVote system, a company called Cybersecurity. If you look at the AEC's pamphlets about the Senate counting solution, it's all Fuji Xerox, but if you look on AusTender, it's a Cybersecurity system, at least part of it. So it's never had any kind of reasonable public scrutiny. We don't even really know exactly how it works. We don't really know who made which parts of it. We really don't know anything about it at all. And it's never seen the light of day. It's never had any scrutiny by anybody independent who really knew what they were doing, or if they had, they weren't allowed to make a report about it. So we basically know nothing about how our Senate votes are translated into the digitised preferences that are used to choose our senators. And that's appalling, right? I think it's just appalling in principle for the way that democracy should work. Even if you thought they were perfectly trustworthy, or even if computers always behaved exactly as they were supposed to and shouldn't have bugs, at the very least there should be a transparent public explanation of what it is. But on top of that, we know actually that it's not perfect, right? If it's based on electronic scanning of handwriting, we know there's going to be some kind of an error rate. And we know because we've looked at other software, well, any other software, right? Every piece of software has bugs, and other software by the same company has bugs. And even if it doesn't have bugs, you can misconfigure software, you can, accidentally drop a disk or fit the wrong thing into somewhere. It is overwhelmingly unlikely that this process is perfect, and the fact that it's completely secret makes it even less likely than it would have been if it had had a bit of scrutiny. So I think what's really critically important for the Senate count is that we don't trust the software. And what we should do, which is what is done in some of the more advanced US states, is we should wait until it's finished, take the complete list of electronic preferences that it produces, which the AEC posts on the web, right? You can go to the AEC website and you can download a complete list of all the votes and all of the preferences that were on each vote. We should take that list and we should do a proper statistical audit. We should take a random sample of all of the votes in each, we should take a random sample of some votes in each state, and we should go right back to the paper ballot, fish that out of storage or wherever they've put it, and compare whether the paper evidence of how the person actually voted matches the electronic digitized preference produced by the system. And we might need to do quite a lot of that in order to really gain a decent level of confidence that the senators are the right ones.
Which I think, in that same vein of trust, is the old maxim of trust, that it is something that is hard earned and easily lost. And that's the inherent thing in any system, I suppose, is that you have to be able to demonstrate that it is trustworthy and is capable of verification.
Yes.
And anything where Senate Council audits are being done in a secret way, I think speaks volumes about the integrity of the auditable account. Or potentially there are questions that beg easy answers, and the easy answers aren't immediately forthcoming. But I would like to wrap this up with a final question, which I think in the context of the numerous elections on the horizon, some may be world-changing in many senses, in my view. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts if you place yourself in the position of someone sitting in 2050, having experienced the next 30 years in your prediction, sitting in the seat of a person or yourself in 2050 and looking back to where we are now. Do you have a lesson or advice that you could give from 2050 to where we are in 2020?
Election security is really important. And exactly what you said before, it should be verifiable. Like, it shouldn't be a bunch of authorities promised that they'd secured the electoral system. It should be a bunch of administrators showing citizens and scrutineers that the whole process is so transparent that we can see that it's been conducted properly. I think we can do that. We can do that with paper when people come into a polling place. It's not so great over the post. We can do that with computers in a polling place, which addresses many of the needs of voters with disabilities in a way that produces a voter verifiable paper record that can then go into the scrutineering process. But I think we need to make our elections more secure and transparent, not less secure and more convenient, because that's actually not a win.
I think that's a really, really good place to take this, and hopefully we do see a future where that transparency of process and security of vote and verification of that through a system that's with integrity would be a great way for us to go into the future. I'll wrap up there, but I'd like to thank you profusely, Vanessa. That was a very interesting, insightful and highly topical discussion about something that I suspect will permeate all of our lives in the not too distant future and then well into the future. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Electronic Frontiers for, again, having the opportunity to put these talks on. To everyone that's joined, thank you for joining. Thank you for the excellent questions that were asked. It's great to have the opportunity to have a direct exposure to an expert in the field like Vanessa and to be able to field those questions. And thanks to Robin Doherty and his team at ThoughtWorks again for powering these sessions. I'll leave it there. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, Angus.